Hey everyone, and welcome to the Rareliquid podcast. Today I'm interviewing Jen Kim, who is a fellow Wharton MBA classmate and someone who has worked in investment banking, management consulting, and private equity. And it's really hard to break into any of these industries, and the fact that she was able to work in all three of them really speaks a lot to her ability. And also she's able to just provide a very unique perspective, having worked in all three of these industries. And so throughout our discussion, she really is able to compare and contrast them and provide this perspective that a lot of others are not able to do. And so I hope you enjoy this upcoming interview. Now, before we get started, according to ChatGPT, 60 to 80% of all consultants at McKinsey, Bain, and BCG have an MBA. And so this means that if you want to work in consulting, most likely at some point, you're going to need to consider getting an MBA. And so that's why I want to let you guys all know about Target Test Prep, or TTP, which I credit a lot for helping me get a 750 on the GMAT. In case you didn't know, the GMAT is now called the GMAT Focus, and TTP already has over 4,000 practice problems in their questions bank with video solutions for all three sections of the exam, making TTP a one-stop shop for GMAT prep. What I liked most about TTP is that it breaks down everything that appears on the GMAT into individual topics, and with them come lessons and practice tests ranging from easy, medium to hard that lets you hone your skills and master each topic. TTP is also the only company on GMAT Club with a triple-digit 5-star rating, and they also have a score improvement guarantee. If you're interested in applying to business school and need to take the GMAT, I highly recommend TTP, and you can check them out for 5 days for just $1 if you use my link in this episode's description. All right, Jen, so thanks so much for agreeing to speak with me today. And can you just first start off by giving us an overview about yourself personally and just professionally?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. So I'm Jen. I'm from Seoul, Korea originally, and actually grew up for the most part in Auckland, New Zealand, and Sydney, Australia, and moved to the States to do my undergrad at WashU. Studied econ and finance in undergrad, and started my career in finance and investment banking. Did that for a little over a year. Then spent a couple years doing consulting, and then a few more years doing private equity before coming to Wharton to do my business school.
Awesome. And you have such a wide range of different professional experiences, and also you moved around quite a bit. Starting off with your upbringing, kind of like what made you kind of move around so much into all these kind of different countries when you were younger?
Yeah, so it was like completely tied to my dad's work. So he started out working in international trading. He also was an entrepreneur. So he, I think, picked up and dropped a bunch of businesses, and that took us to a handful of different countries. But I think ultimately it was a really great experience. I think getting that international exposure really early, and then just I think growing up in those places where there's a lot of just beautiful scenery all around.
Yeah. Awesome. And which country do you feel like feels most like home to you now?
It's a little hard to say. I feel like Korea has always felt like home, despite the fact that I didn't get sort of schooling in Korea per se, or have a lot of my friends in my age range in Korea. I think there's a cultural sort of layer and also just the fact that I'm feel connected to it through my parents. That really kind of hits home for me a little more so.
Got it. And you moved to the US for college, was that right?
Yep.
And then after college, you started working in banking first after undergrad. So can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to first go into banking?
Yeah, so I'd say my pathway into banking was a little less intentional than my subsequent career moves. So I, as I mentioned, I studied finance and econ in undergrad. Actually front-loaded my econ work, and then had just had my very first finance course, and was looking into different summer internship options for my junior year, and found out this firm, Baird, which I was sort of familiar with, was doing on-campus recruiting. And so I just showed up. I remember I fumbled on a bunch of their technical questions, but somehow still came out with an offer. Did that for my junior year summer, really enjoyed the work. Kind of just mix of M&A advisory work and equity capital raise. And so ended up joining full time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Sometimes people, when they look at careers for other people, I usually actually, at least at school for MBA at Wharton, people kind of seem to be coming from one side. One is like, I have been preparing a lot throughout my life to do banking and then private equity, or I've always wanted to like go into consulting since freshman year. Other people I meet, kind of like you, are like, oh, I kind of just stumbled to this and then this and then this. Even I actually know one classmate who continually has quote unquote stumbled from her undergrad to banking to private equity. And so it's interesting. I think it's just also actually helpful and reassuring to hear from people with your kind of story too. I think people sometimes feel like they need to have everything figured out, but it's helpful to kind of like figure things out as you go along as well. And I'm curious to know, for when you were in banking, like which group did you join? Which office were you in? And how would you describe your experience overall?
Yeah, so at Baird, I was actually in their St. Louis office, which is a smaller office. In terms of industry exposure, I covered energy and industrials. And so both industries are very sort of macro tied. And so I found that really interesting from just like a modeling standpoint in terms of the deals I was working with. Oftentimes I was working with like Fortune 500 companies. And I think that exposure is really great. And I think the benefit of being in a slightly smaller office is you get a lot more of that direct touch point with the managing directors and more of the hands-on sort of mentorship at the middle level as well. So overall had a really positive experience.
And could you clarify for, I guess, everyone watching, which office you recruited into, and how was that first day, in comparison to the previous work you were doing in banking? I think there is quite a lot of overlap, and you kind of touched upon why you made this switch, but how was that transition for you?
Yeah, maybe like stepping back for a second, I feel like the transition was actually pretty interesting too. So once I think realized that consulting could be an interesting next step, I started to kind of do a lot of cold calls. I think one of the hardest things actually in the recruiting process for MBBs outside of your traditional like on-campus recruiting is getting an interview. And I knew that just applying online, my application could go into the ether and sort of not hear back for a while. And so I started like cold calling, actually got in touch with a few partners in the Chicago office. And I think coming out of those conversations, they actually connected me with the hiring team. And so the interview process actually went really quickly from there. And so I was part of the Chicago office. And as I mentioned, they hadn't to have a generalist model until like the mid to senior level up. And so was covering anything between like healthcare, tech, retail, CPG.
Got it. And so then how did you, I guess, since we're on the topic of recruiting, like how did you prepare for the consulting cases? Did you already feel like your business background gave you like a good foundation and you just practiced some cases, or did you kind of go hardcore into casing like many cases per week? And how did you prepare for the interviews?
Great question. And I'd say it was really tough for me being a full-time banker, just in terms of having freeing up the bandwidth, right? But I certainly had some of the business intuition from banking, and I think getting up to speed on from reading business use. But that aside, I think there's a lot of free resources online, like free and not free resources online. I think like reading through the Victor Chang casebook is really helpful. A lot of the business schools also publish their own casebooks. So I think just kind of understanding what the structure and format or different permutations of cases could be, and going through a couple like dry runs with friends who are current consultants were really helpful in terms of just getting into that rhythm and being prepared.
So then after how many cases did you feel like you were ready for the interviews?
I want to say in terms of like actual mock interviews I did for some friends, I probably did like a dozen, and then sort of headed into the interview process.
Okay, got it. And I think people are always really curious to know about which resources were most helpful. You mentioned Victor Chang, you mentioned looking up the case books for different schools. And I think if you're not if you haven't recruited for consulting, then this might be new to a lot of people watching or listening about basically a lot of the top business schools kind of replicate some cases that have, I think, been cases in actual interviews from a lot of the top consulting firms. And then they kind of recreate the cases with the prompts and then data. And then there's like solutions. And I think if you look online and kind of search something like Harvard Consulting Case Book or something, exactly, there's one like every year, right? So those resources were helpful. Was there any other resources that was very helpful for you for recruiting for consulting?
Yeah, I think just getting a lot of those reps generally is helpful. And also some of the consulting firms have like some mock interview resources like online. And so I remember BCG had an interactive one where you could kind of like click through like choose your own adventure type of case interview format. That was, I think, really helpful. And then just mostly leaning into some sample cases to get a sense of like the full range of what you could expect.
Got it. Okay. And when you were recruiting, and your process is a little bit different from the immediately post undergrad and graduate because you were a lateral hire. Mm-hmm. So what was your process like? Did you have like a first round interview and then a super day, or did you have more rounds than that? What did the process look like for you?
Yeah, so for me, there are 2 rounds. So I had a first round that were like 3 case interview formats. And both were one was with a project leader and then and 2 principals thereafter. For super day, it was two interviewers. So the first one was a mix of behavioral, and then there was a case component, but you get an information deck that you sort of have to sift through and then make a recommendation on after you get some time to digest. And then the second was a more traditional case interview format.
Okay. And do you feel like in order to eventually get the offer, you need to almost be flawless throughout the cases, or is there room for any mistakes or errors? What's your kind of take on that?
Yeah, so I'd say coming out of my super day, I thought I did nicely, but I also recognize that with any sort of interview process, it's all relative, right? And so there are certainly, I think, spots where I could have been a little more refined. I think what probably sealed the deal for me was actually during my super day case interview where I'd say it sort of leveled up in terms of complexity than the first round. And I remember the interview was really like pressure, so testing you on multiple grounds, including like how you react with pressure. I forget the exact question, but there was one question where he asked for me to generate a handful of ideas. So I gave him 3, and he continued to push until I came up with 10 more ideas.
Wow.
And so I think the format can, evolve just to further filter candidates when it goes to sort of like the later round. So that's something
that's interesting, because I was also interested in recruiting back in undergrad. And I remember, I also looked into consulting recruiting, worked at Deloitte for a summer. And I do remember coming across for MBB interviews, I think in particular, a lot of times they'll ask like, what else? So you'll say something and they'll be like, what else? And then they'll say something and be like, what else? And really put you on the spot. And for you, did you, I don't know, just happen to being creative when you're put in the spot like that? Or did you kind of lean on previous frameworks that you had been thinking about, or like, and kind of drew from there in order to answer more as this interviewer kept pressing on? Like, how did you basically go through that mini exercise successfully?
Yeah, I don't think there's a good way to prepare. I think just like spontaneity is something that I think comes with getting some reps with mock cases and whatnot. I remember that specific case, it was in a very like niche, bespoke industry. I think it was like agricultural tech or something along the line. So there wasn't any kind of background context in the industry that I could sort of lean into. And so I think it was just trying to be a little bit creative and just respond on the fly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, I mean, with recruiting, there's always no magic silver bullet for anything. I think that's actually also a really good kind of litmus test for people when they're deciding between the two industries. I think a lot of people in undergrad, I certainly for myself was debating between banking and consulting, kind of flip-flop back and forth for me. But I think for banking, while there's not as much room for creativity, you know, DCF is a DCF. You have to memorize what you need to memorize and understand how things work with, let's say, the 3 financial statements. With a case, it's kind of like an essay where there is a kind of right direction and answer, but you can get to it in a slightly creative way compared to banking in particular. And I remember when I was also recruiting for consulting, just seeing such a wide range of different types of questions, whether it's like profitability or market entry, all of that. And so I think it's a good test to see like which industry is a better fit for you as you're actually preparing for recruiting. And I'm wondering if you could provide, maybe if you can bring to light kind of one of the cases that you were given during an interview, if any kind of pop out to your mind. I know it's been a while for you, so no worries if not. But I think it would just be helpful for people if they could get a sense of what a case is through like an example prompt or something like that.
Yeah, I'm trying to, it's a long time ago. I think in like a very like macro level, I remember getting a case that was in the healthcare industry, and it was evaluating whether or not they should like invest into a specific drug within the pipeline. And then I think it was like around calculating the profitability and sort of risk implications of that portfolio.
Oh, that's actually interesting because I did a first round for BCG back in, I forget, like maybe 8 years ago, maybe longer. And I also got a pharma case. And it was also about profitability. But I think we must have had very different because I was in a totally different office. But your banking background must have been pretty helpful in terms of like having a good understanding of all the numbers and profitability and how all of that fit in an income statement and all of that.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot of like there's certainly math aspects through it. It's not hard math, but I think for certain people that quant aspect can certainly trip you up.
Yeah, because I totally agree. The math isn't hard, but under pressure, you can easily forget a zero, which screws everything up. Right. So what did you do to practice the math?
I think I generally have been pretty savvy on the math front, and so it came a little naturally for me. It was more, I guess, something I didn't mention before, something that's really helpful to just engage an interviewer in one of these interview processes is really kind of talk out loud and walk them through the process. And so even like minor math calculations, kind of writing that out on a sheet of paper and then just guiding the interviewer more explicitly through the math aspects, and then also just like some of the structure and framework aspects is certainly helpful.
Yeah, thinking out loud, definitely a piece of advice I constantly got when I was recruiting for consulting too. And you, on the topic still a little bit about banking versus consulting, since you do have experience in both, and that's not really common. How did you find let's start off with the easy stuff, I guess, like the work-life balance. There are stark differences between the two. What did you think were kind of the pros and cons from each of these two industries, from your kind of lived experience?
Yeah, so very different, I'd say, in terms of, I think, just expectations on the job. I think some of the skills you really need to flex. And I think like culturally too, on the topic of work-life balance is certainly better in consulting. That being said, it's in banking, your sign-off hours could be later, but there are certainly like lulls throughout the day. There's some downtime when you're waiting on comments. Whereas I feel like in consulting, generally I was working nonstop from like beginning of the day through end of the day, even if we're closing out earlier for a team dinner. And so there's just generally a lot more that I need to sort of work through. And so as a part of that, it was really, really important to manage your time really ruthlessly, since there's a million things on the scope you have eventually sort of have to work through and ensure it doesn't fall through the cracks.
Yeah, that's. I think that's definitely one of the interesting things about banking is, also it really depends. When you're on a live deal, you could be definitely working from 9, 10 a.m. all the way to 3 a.m. And you can have meetings back to back, or you can just be working on model or PowerPoint nonstop. But there is a lot of times when you may have like a slow period and not really be working on much. So I actually wanted you to also kind of explain what like being on the beaches or on the bench for consulting, because I think it's kind of one of the quote unquote hidden perks of consulting.
Yeah. So for I think viewers that might not be familiar with like the notion of the beach is basically between projects when you have like a little bit of downtime. I personally, I think at least during the window I was in consulting, it was a very like busy time. And so I didn't have a whole lot of downtime on the bench. That being said, typically what you would do is help principals or partners working on proposals. So those proposals could eventually translate to a case, but helping to pull some of the decks together. You could also be doing some internally facing work around like knowledge decks that you might put together as a reference point for the consulting team. But typically, I would say beach time for me has been less than a week or around a week.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting because I guess first to explain a little bit from what I understand, because I've had friends who worked at MBB and as well, and I think there was a wide range where first, when at least in banking, a lot of times I remember myself and other analysts, we would just finish this huge deal we're working on, and we finally like just sigh with relief, and then we get hit the next day with a new project. Or we just have multiple projects always going on anyway, and so sometimes it was kind of felt like nonstop. It sounded like for you, it was also kind of nonstop, but I have also heard on that some MBB consultants, when they're on the beach a lot, it could be for, I don't know, more than a week, like 2 weeks, let's say, if things are a bit slower. And during that time, like how many hours are you working? Because I don't actually know exactly, but I know it's a lot less than your normal hours, right? So what do consulting hours look like when you're on the beach versus full-time?
Yeah, I mean, there could be certainly like some days trickled in where you're like doing minimal work during the day. Typically, it'd be anywhere between maybe like 50%, 60% of a normal work day. And I'd say proposal work, it sort of depends if it's all hands on deck. This is a really important proposal that would be entail a really large team behind it, and you're doing a lot of expert interviews. I think those are more time-consuming work streams, and so I'd say it sort of varies, but generally it's anywhere between like 50 to 60%.
Okay, and so how many hours a week were you working in consulting?
On average, or on the beach?
Kind of. I know that there's a range, so maybe actually if you could provide a range of like, here's like a small number of hours, here's a mean average, and here's like a really intense number of hours.
Yeah. So one thing I would caveat is it's like very client dependent. And actually in the staffing process, like within the Chicago office, actually there's certain clients that were like notorious for being tough to work for. Others where, it's more of like a walk in the park. You sort of know it's a 9 to 5 type of deal. And so I think that like getting some of that intel internally like helps you navigate and try to work out a better work-life balance sort of arrangement with the right client. On the low end, I've had one project actually that was closer to 9 to 5, so about 40 hours a week. And on the high end, which was a turnaround project, and it was had a number of work streams going, it was like close to 80 hours.
Okay.
So massive variance. But on average, I'd say like 55 to 60 hours.
Yeah. And were you working these hours without working weekends? Or were you also, for the tougher projects, working during the weekends?
So I rarely worked on the weekends, which is a dramatic shift from my banking days and also my time in private equity. I'd say there's there's certain times where I just wanted to, I think, read up on certain things that could be helpful heading into the next week, or just get organized. That was like, I think, just self-driven as opposed to something that was like really asked of me or needed to get done.
Got it. So then those 80 hours where you're working not on weekends, because bankers, when they say they work 80 hours, it includes the weekends. But I think if you're working 80 hours Monday through Friday, that's like a whole lot tougher than working Monday through Sunday. So I guess it does sound like even though you don't always have even though you always do have your weekends off, consulting can also, or is also, very intense when you have those like tough projects that you're working on. And I wanted to ask more about the consulting industry and your experience. But overall, kind of starting as a basic, to preface everything, people love to kind of poke fun at the consulting industry, saying that they don't really do much, or like people aren't sure what their value is. So I guess from your perspective, having been in the industry, can you first actually just explain in general what consultants do?
Sure. So I think consultants, in essence, you're coming in and solving a really sort of big, meaty problem that the client organization is grappling with that they aren't able to address internally. And that could be, more functionally focused. So, for instance, they are starting to rethink how they should set up their organization in terms of sort of HR and different functional units. It could be, thinking about rethinking how they go to market. It could be defining their growth strategy for the next 5 years, or maybe they're seeing a very negative trend in top line and profitability, and they want to turn that around. And so, in terms of the sort of scope of the project, it can certainly vary quite a bit, but ultimately, it's kind of bringing more of the tried and true lens of consultants, having done dozens and dozens of similar projects and having that pattern recognition so that you're able to sort of apply those learning in these new environments.
Yeah, I kind of think about it in this way, and let me know if I'm wrong, but let's say that you go to a therapist and that person has seen so many cases of people with, let's say, mental health issues, or people who have struggled with like existentialism or like feeling lost. And they have this specialty of helping people with their training and their experience to navigate their lives, even though the people themselves actually know their lives better than their therapist, right? And so that I kind of think about it in that way, where a company, even though internally it can seem like they would know best in terms of how to fix their profitability or enter a new market or decide on a new product or strategy, a lot of times having that outside help and someone like who I guess in my analogy, therapist would be a consulting firm, step in with this outside perspective and experience is really helpful in being able to kind of guide the company in the right direction. Do you think like that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice analogy. And I think in generally speaking, that sort of outside in lens is super helpful. I think even with the largest companies out there can be organizational inertia that sits in. And so I think bringing that outside lens, sometimes we sort of highlight cross-industry vignettes to sort of like spark imagination from like what businesses are doing in completely different industries, working through a similar problem. Also, I think another benefit of consultants is bringing some of the independence. So things like doing voice of customer interviews. It's probably something that's a little tougher to do internally, right, with your own customers. And so having a sort of an unbiased third party come in and really sort of poke at different questions that might be hard to ask internally, whether it's to employees or customers, I think is another big value add.
Got it. And so I wanted to also kind of ask about the partners who are specializing in certain types of projects. Because that's, I think the misconception a lot of times comes from when people look at consulting firms overall, they think that they don't have a specialty, because you do, at least when you're younger, in the lower ranks of a consulting firm, you're working on various different types of projects with different clients and partners. But did you see that when you get to the more partner level, you're kind of constantly seeing partners working on a very similar type of project, but for different clients? Or were there also some partners who were selling projects that were pretty different? So for example, like was there like a, I don't know, cost optimization type partner or like a market entry type partner? Or was it also kind of healthcare specific or expertise partners? Like how do the partners specialize as you move up the ranks in consulting?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna caveat by saying this is like BCG specific. I know there's certain consulting firms that out there that actually want pretty junior people to specialize like early on. BCG I think was intentional about giving that generalist experience, since there's a lot of benefits to working with different business models, right? That being said, I want to say there's usually starting at the principal level, tends to be specialization by industry. And so that sort of trickles up top when you look at partners. Typically, like whether it's healthcare or in terms of like functional expertise, it might be supply chain. It's usually not narrow in terms of like a case type, like you mentioned, like new market entry. That's not necessarily something they'd focus on. The growth strategy is a really common case type, and but there are partners that do a lot of that in the context of healthcare and the context of CPG, tech. So I'd say there's a lot of industry specialization at the senior ranks, and then also I think it's sort of a flywheel where you start to these partners start to develop relationships within an industry, and so that kind of I think drives additional deal flow from there.
Got it. And did you feel like when you went in on the client site and you were helping the client with their projects, was it easy to get buy-in? Because a lot of times I do think that the clients are hiring you guys, but it could be coming from a more senior person, and then at least from what I know, you're not always working only with the C-suite, right? Because they have so much other things to do. So you a lot of times work with like VPs or middle level managers in order to gather data and kind of like work towards a deliverable. Did you find that generally speaking, the client was easier to work with, or did they sometimes push back, or what was that experience like?
Yeah, so I'd say getting buy-in was not the easiest feat. Although I've heard from folks who've been in operating roles within companies, it's actually even harder because you have to do a lot of soft influence, right? Whereas to your point, in consulting, typically you have a sponsor that's someone very senior at the client organization. They're sort of rallying the troop and sort of, I think, reinforcing to the lower and mid-level people that this is really important. We're paying millions of dollars to bring BCG consultants in. So I think that backing at the top level certainly helps in terms of, I think, getting these lower mid-level people to be a little more responsive to things like data requests, to meeting requests. But ultimately, I think change management is really hard to get right. And so what I found is really important is, as they're working through, is just bringing people along. And what I try to do sort of ahead of any data request or client meeting is just try to really reinforce and establish the context. We're asking for this to really feed into this sort of larger vision or question we're looking to address, right? And so I think providing that context and trying to be really transparent about why we need a certain thing and how helpful their contribution could be to this larger picture, I think has been really helpful in terms of getting that buy-in.
Got it. And kind of following up on that, when you're starting off in consulting, and you were probably, I guess, in your younger 20s at that time, and I felt like this in banking too, where I was, 22, 23 years old, and then I have many layers of teammates above me who will check my work. In banking though, like I never as an analyst needed to really go to a client and talk to them. I can imagine in consulting, like I experienced a little bit in my summer consulting internship, you can have like imposter syndrome where you're like, oh, I'm this 20-year-old kid and I'm giving advice to these huge companies. How did you ever feel like that at all? Did you ever have kind of, I guess, grapple with your confidence in that kind of setting? If you didn't, then maybe we can skip this question. But if you did, like, how did you kind of overcome those kinds of issues if you had them?
Yeah. So I think just like getting to a point where I feel like I, belong, at the table, like took a little bit of time. And I think it was almost harder coming from a place like banking that tends to be like pretty hierarchical where, oftentimes the analysts might be sitting in a client meeting, but they're there to answer questions about the model. And you're not sort of substantively contributing to that conversation, whereas in consulting, you're there's a clear expectation that you should come to the table, with an opinion and sort of view on how we should proceed. Also at BCG, we have this like soft rule that you're presenting whatever slide you put together. And so I think there's a lot of like ownership around like stakeholder management, just presenting certain like takeaways to clients that that's sort of pushed on you at the most junior level, right? And so I think ultimately just getting a lot of reps, also just putting more of that time into meeting preparation to make sure that that you have the materials down and also have a lot of the context the client might be curious about back pocket. I think that helps with the confidence, but ultimately it's just getting a lot of reps that ultimately sort of builds that confidence and starts to erode more of the imposter syndrome that gets set in.
I mean, in the corporate world, I never actually really had too much of that experience. Like you said, I've only been to a few client meetings, but we were never, as an analyst in banking, expected to present our pages or anything like that. I think that's actually probably a pretty good practice, and it really speeds up your development quite a bit. And on that note, I guess I wanted to ask if you could kind of touch upon the professional skills that you felt like you gained the most from consulting, and beyond maybe just like PowerPoint, Excel, if there was anything else, maybe more on the qualitative side that you felt was super helpful.
Yeah, so I'd say one thing is, on the sort of communication front, it's really like storytelling with data. That's really important because a lot of the upfront sort of analytical work, you're very much in the weeds, but ultimately, you really need to sort of pull out and focus on headlining to clients that are much senior, right? They want to engage at a much more sort of higher level. You want to really draw attention to the most impactful points, and really sort of caution against getting a little too in the weeds where the client is lost. So that sort of headlining and storytelling and framing things in the right way so it's digestible to your audience was a really helpful skill that I've certainly carried forward since. Another thing, I say just being really dynamic. So especially at BCG where I was a generalist, and cycling through a lot of these projects where I had to get up to speed on a new business and industry very quickly. Basically ramping up on a new industry in under a week is really tough. And so I think just being able to ingest information really, really quickly. And so I think at that point you start to be useful in terms of like helping out the strategy around the topic at hand.
If throughout this interview, you've been thinking a lot about how you want to break into management consulting, investment banking, or eventually get an MBA, I've been working extremely hard over the past year on courses for each of these three, and I'm aiming for them to be the best in-class product and resource you can utilize in order to break into either of those two industries or to get your MBA. And so, for example, for the consulting course, I'm working on people who have worked at McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. For the banking course, I worked at JP Morgan, but I'm also working with people who have worked at Goldman Sachs and Evercore as well. And for the MBA course, I'm working on it with a few fellow Wharton MBA classmates. And so if you want to sign up for any of these, I'm giving out huge discounts of 50% for those who sign up early. You can sign up for any of these courses if you check out the links for them in this episode's description. When it came to your bosses in consulting, I know you kind of have like different layers of bosses, and because you have the people you directly report to, and then you have your partners who maybe drop by every like once a week or something like that. What made for good consulting seniors to you, and what made for bad ones?
Yeah. So on the good side, so first of all, I'd say partners in general, they're pretty fragmented. You're up to the project leader level, you're covering a single project at a given point in time. They could be straddling 5-6 different projects in a given point. And so they're sort of really engaging in the case more sporadically. So I'll sort of focus my discussion around like principals and project leaders. I think a really good PL is when they're doing a really proactive job in terms of stakeholder and sort of client expectation management. And sort of, I think blocking, I feel like clients often have the tendency to, ask more than what was originally sort of aligned on. And so I think a good PL will, sort of be the blocker to manage things like a really bad scope creep, or if a client is pushing a certain request that isn't really value add or sort of incremental to what we're solving for. I think just sort of managing all that dynamic that makes, I think, the junior, the associate and consultant's life a lot easier. So I think that's a really key piece. The second one, and I think that's probably sounds a little obvious, is like the feedback loop and how I think effective they are and proactive they are around communicating that. I think the benefit of consulting is, feedback is something that's heavily emphasized. There's a huge culture around feedback, and after each project, there's a very sort of in-depth review across key dimensions. But I think a good PL that I've worked with in the past, does a lot of informal sort of, feedback with respect to like communication or other things coming out of each sort of client milestone, like a really big meeting. And I think just provides a lot of tactical feedback along the way.
Yeah, and I can agree. I think there is some similarity there in the first part in particular, from my experience in banking too, where the best, I just remember the best associates for me that I worked with were the ones who could really push back on clients and from the seniors and be like, oh, actually, in order for Ben to do this, it's actually going to take twice as long as you might think. So we need more days, which would be music to my ears. I would say actually for in banking at least, I didn't get as much feedback, and I think I have heard this about consulting where there is much of a stronger feedback culture. Like for example, in banking, I remember people would go into their mid-year reviews or their end of the year review and totally not expect what the outcome actually would be, and that affects their bonus and stuff, and it could cause a lot of drama and issues. I've heard in consulting that you do get a lot of like constant feedback, and I don't know if there's service, but I guess I wanted to know if you could provide a little bit more on the specifics. You said there's like different dimensions that you're kind of like given feedback for. Is it kind of written plus oral or verbal kind of feedback, or is it all mostly just kind of a report you get at the end of a project? Can you kind of go more into the details of what feedback looks like at BCG?
Yeah, so there's sort of soft feedback throughout, which you certainly like block off time each week with your PL or principal to really kind of get that in a more informal setting. That being said, there's a more formal feedback at the end of each case that I can't remember the key dimensions, but there's, for example, like execution. So your ability to quickly turn the work, the quality of the work, how thoughtful and on point is the content. And then there's a communication piece around sort of executive stakeholder management and your ability to, I think, deliver insights in a really crisp way. And then I forget, there's a couple others in there. But another thing I thought BCG did really nicely is beyond your sort of project team, you also have a principal that you're paired with. They're called like your advisor. And so that person gives you sort of like that independent sort of resource that you can lean into. So if you come out of a case with maybe a negative experience, or you have a certain preference in terms of the direction you'd like to go in terms of future staffing, you have that sort of independent resource that you can sort of lean into that can advocate for you.
That sounds like it would have been really helpful for me when I was in banking. Like I really don't know actually if maybe it was from my end that where I could have done more, but I guess I always felt so busy that I didn't want to set up something like a one-on-one every week with my associate or even every month for some feedback. But looking back, I guess like I should have done maybe at least like after each big deal, asking for a little bit more feedback. But kind of moving more towards more of like the day in the life of a consultant. Can you kind of go into what your responsibilities kind of look like each day? And I know actually projects are so different and what you work on changes each day as well. But what does a typical day in the life of a consultant look like?
Yeah, so I would say, there's a lot of time spent up front with the client and with your team to align on the scope, right? And so ultimately you're moving through the key milestones. And so in a given day, say I'm on the phase really focus on data gathering and ultimately trying to get to hypotheses around what direction makes sense on a particular case. So that work could be doing a lot of expert interviews. So there's a handful of third-party providers like GLG, Alpha Sites that have this massive roster of industry experts and seasoned executives to sort of pull from. To answer really targeted questions you might have to get up to speed on a specific industry. And so, expert interviews, I think having conversations internally about specific data needs to ultimately, prove or disprove those hypotheses you're moving towards. So that could be, sort of consume a lot of my time. And then towards the end of the day, after I get through a lot of those meetings and calls, it's kind of translating that all that information on pages that we can I can socialize internally within my team for a brief update, and then ultimately sort of feeding into any client meetings I might have coming up as an update.
Got it. And so I think that was a great overview of what each day looks like. And now I want to ask, because I've heard at least this might have been way further in the past. I know some consulting firms used to let you charge on your personal card, so you rack up all these points, and then you get a reimbursement or something like that. But at BCG, during your time, did you have like a corporate card where you needed to charge for all the travel? What was it like?
Yeah, I did have a corporate card. So I didn't have those benefits. I think the main benefits in terms of points come from like the airline and hotel credits and points you rack up.
Yeah, so wait, how do you rack those up if you have a separate corporate card for your travel? You know what I mean? Like do you transfer, like let's say you
on the flights, it's like basically you earn miles, right? So that's regardless of what card you use, you're still going to get that benefit.
I see.
And so I was actually not as like calculating with this, but I know some people would only fly a certain airline, even if some of the time windows aren't as convenient to sort of optimize those miles. And then same thing with like the hotel carriers.
Got it. Yeah, I remember when I was at Deloitte during my summer internship, I had kind of a local one. So I drove instead of flying, but then they would put me in a pretty nice hotel. I forget which one it was, but I just remember back then I was maybe 19, 20. And, you're put into these nice hotels. It's like kind of cool. But I also remember feeling after working one night, it was like Thursday or Wednesday or so, I was able to expense a meal up to like $50. And so I got like a nice sushi meal. I was eating in my hotel room and I was quote unquote kind of living my own little dream. But I was at the end of the day in a hotel room by myself. I couldn't share it with like my friends. And that's something I hear a lot from consultants, like the travel, the lifestyle of, flying business class every 2 times a week, being in a nice hotel. It can start to kind of wear you down as opposed to be something that you enjoy. How is that for you, especially as time went on?
Yeah, and I can sort of get to it later, but travel was definitely one of the reasons I decided to leave consulting, just given how disruptive it is to your work. But to your point, you're very busy, in consulting, right? So I fly business class, but I would typically be working the whole time. And I'd be on a 6 a.m. flight and sort of so punching away on my keyboard on my laptop, and people next to me would be looking at me sort of oddly. And so that was a very sort of normal cadence of work, and also I think just eating alone at a hotel bar or at a hotel room, it can certainly feel very isolating. That being said, there's some bright spots. You have sometimes like team dinners at Michelin star restaurants, a lot of perks, but I think over time you still want more of that stability, right, in your personal life and just a more normal cadence that isn't necessarily sort of interfered with constant travel.
Yeah. At any point, did you actually even think like, oh, I kind of miss banking, or were you super glad that you, throughout the few years you were at BCG, you were like, oh, like I made the right decision?
I would say the latter. I mean, the work itself is far more interesting, at least in my mind. And that being said, towards my end of my time in consulting, I started to think, what next? And I'd say generally speaking, there's a lot of people in consulting that sort of treat consulting similar to banking as sort of like an interim step. And it does give you a lot of different sort of transferable skills to flex. And so I think it's actually very common for people to leave after a couple years in consulting. Very few lifers, at least from what I've seen. And so I think I sort of treated it as such as well.
What actually on that topic, like what do you feel like makes for a good consultant? Like when people are thinking about, should I go into consulting? How would you suggest that they think about who they are and whether or not they're a good fit for this industry?
Yeah. So in terms of, I think some of the basics, right? You should enjoy working with people. You're constantly sort of interacting with teams internally, but also interfacing with clients constantly, or in the context of meetings and calls. You also want to, you should be comfortable being uncomfortable, just given the dynamic and context is changing all the time. You're dealing with very ambiguous problems compared to situations like banking where it's more of a repeatable rinse and repeat playbook. There's less of that in consulting. And I'd say just you should enjoy travel. There's certainly consulting firms out there that are more sort of local home models, like Bain is an example of that. That being said, places like BCG, McKinsey, there's a lot of travel involved, and so that should be something that you're comfortable with. And on the flip side, I think if you don't like any of those things, you prefer having more of a stable and sort of continuous cadence where you can get a lot deeper in an industry and work with a lot of the same teams, and consulting might not be the best fit for you.
And you mentioned the top competitors, and they're always grouped together: McKinsey, Bain, BCG. What are the things that separate BCG? Because I think when a client, let's say, has a project, they, from what I know, will get pitches or something like that, or at least speak to the partners at the different firms and decide on kind of which consulting firm to work with. Now, granted, also a lot of clients have really strong relationships with partners, and maybe they'll always use the same consulting firm. But from my understanding, the different consulting firms will have their own kind of unique way of approaching a given problem or something like that. How do you feel like BCG kind of separated itself from McKinsey and Bain when pitching to clients?
Yeah, so I'd say that's something I didn't have too much visibility into from a pitching standpoint. An example that comes to mind was my time in PE, where we're actually looking for a consulting firm to do a commercial due diligence on one of our portfolio companies, and so I, interviewed some folks from McKinsey and BCG and a few other of the boutique consulting firms. And I think the difference came from how they sort of brought in resources. So I remember, in our meeting, like BCG, they had 6 different sort of quote unquote experts that had the industry experience, maybe some cross industry experience that was relevant to the context. And I think it was just really helpful in terms of bringing those resources together and recognizing that we might not necessarily use them for this particular project, but really seem to care about building the relationship. Not to say McKinsey didn't take a similar approach, but I thought that the relationship and sort of resourcing aspect was a little more pronounced with BCG.
What was McKinsey's approach? So if BCG was a little bit more, we'll have all these experts and we have all these people, what did it feel like McKinsey's kind of approach was?
Yeah, so I'd say BCG, they had a sort of a larger team, on the call. I feel like McKinsey, there was sort of like a poll partner that was sort of anchoring the discussion, and then maybe like a couple other more folks. But there's certainly like a single sort of really key expert, and then a few others. Whereas BCG, it felt like it was more balanced in terms of perspectives they're trying to pull into.
Got it. Who did you guys end up going with?
So we ended up going with, I think I think Bain.
Oh, got it.
Just because I think they had the pricing was a lot better.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
That being said, I think we ended up using BCG for something else.
Got it. Yeah, and Bain also works with PE. They're like kind of have a stronger specialty in PE from what I know, right?
Yeah,
From
they do
consulting.
a lot more PE.
Yeah. I guess now it'd be great to actually discuss more about your experience in PE. And, it's not easy to go from consulting to private equity, but I guess you also did have some banking experience as well. How was that recruiting process and transition from, I don't know, you were in a very unique situation, I guess, because it wasn't purely consulting to PE, but how did you, how did you first decide to make the switch to private equity? And then what did the process look like for you?
Yeah, so I primarily leveraged headhunters, which made it like super easy. I feel like they're already sending a lot of things once I sort of indicated interest that I was interested in moving over to the buy side. And so I think one, it was just like syncing up to the 5 or 6 key headhunters right there, and kind of prefacing what geography and sort of, I think, industry and an investing model I was interested in. And I'd say, certainly banking to PE is the most common route. That being said, there's now a lot more, consultants that also go into, investing. I think just finding the firms that have a higher appetite for pulling in consulting experiences and sort of leaning into that certainly helps. So for me, I interviewed it was sort of end to end, like almost took slightly over a month. So it was a pretty quick process.
Yeah, that's really fast.
But I interviewed with a handful of firms in New York, and actually one in Chicago. I was recruiting off cycle, and I had a strong preference for staying locally in Chicago, and so I took that offer.
What were you looking for in a PE firm? Because there's so many different ways that PE firms differentiate amongst each other. What were you looking for as you were recruiting?
Yeah, so I was pretty biased. In the mid-market, I had the perception that it might be better hours than some of the mega funds out there, which I think can be not true necessarily from my experience. I think that being said, so mid-market, I also knew that the teams would be leaner, and so I'd sort of own a lot more of that deal funnel and process. So I cared about that. I also cared about the industry they're covering, right? And so WinPoint, I was actually a generalist, but they're covering consumer business services. Those are industries that I found really interesting. So certainly sort of lean into that, and also just the culture. So WinPoint, they have this sort of friendly Midwestern culture, and that's a big selling point, even when they're sort of, I think, pitching the firm to different different sellers. Is we're like nice capital, and we approach with a good partnership mindset, which now a lot more PE firms sort of, I think, have that repertoire, but that's something I genuinely sort of felt in conversing with some of the folks through the recruiting process.
And private equity, now that's an industry where you now have skin in the game. You are the client hiring, client services industries, as you referenced earlier, like investment banks or consulting firms, accounting firms, as you're doing diligence, all these different types of client service companies. How did you feel now that you moved away from client services and became kind of the client or became an investor? What was, when you compare these 3 industries that you were in, did you enjoy it more? Did you enjoy it less? Like, what was your take on, what was your experience like, I guess? in private equity?
Yeah, so I'd say across the three it was definitely the best fit in terms of, I think, like how interesting the work was. And something I didn't mention in terms of my motivation to move into PE from consulting, the travel aside, was really I really wanted more depth and continuity than what consulting provided, which is essentially these 1 to 3 month long projects. You're to present a recommendation, you don't really see things through. You're on to the next one, and so I wanted to still keep some of that diversity, but also start to, I think, build more of a longer relationship with folks and start to get more of the subject matter expertise from partnering with companies a little more long term. So I think that was a big appeal of PE. I think the main thing in being in principal, investing is, one, the stakes are a lot higher. To your point, like it's a lot less transactional where you're just providing the recommendation and you're done. You really need to own your recommendations and decisions, because ultimately when you buy a business, you're carrying that business on your portfolio. And in my case, I was sort of partnering with those 3 portfolio companies, sort of my duration of the time at the firm. And starting to get really close with the CFO and CEO, in some cases, sort of conversing with them on a daily basis. So I think the stakes are certainly flipped. Another thing is you sort of, I think, have a lot more control over your priorities and schedule. You're less so like beholden to specific client asks. That being said, there's a million things to sort of juggle. On the investing side, I was driving a lot of the due diligence process, digging into the financials, meeting with the management teams, but also managing all the third-party work streams, interfacing with the consultants during the market diligence. And so a lot of things on the investing side, and at the same time, my portfolio companies are going to need some help around big strategic things they're solving for. And so I think managing my time really ruthlessly so that I can be sort of, I think, supportive and so to be a resource across all of those different activities is really key.
And given that you have had experience in banking and consulting, when for most consultants, when they go into private equity, they, at least from what I've seen, a lot of time can be in the operation side. But you had banking experience plus consulting experience. You had this unique blend. So how did you kind of use that to your advantage at all when you were trying to, I guess, kind of establish yourself at this new firm? Were there times you felt like you maybe even were at a disadvantage compared to maybe other bankers who came straight from banking after a few years? How did you handle all of that?
Yeah, so first of all, I mentioned I had a pretty significant investing and operating responsibility. And I think the operating side was something I sort of created a platform for. And it wasn't necessarily something that all of the other, associates and, senior associates and VPs had responsibility over. I think it was some of the value add I demonstrated during the management presentations and partnering with some of the portfolio company managers, where I think they realized that I could add a lot of value in terms of the strategy setting, in terms of doing more nuanced, not necessarily financially oriented analyses. And so I found my Portco executives really sort of leaning into that experience. So that ended up sort of taking up a larger part of my role than I'd sort of anticipated in the outset.
And so then what percentage, I guess, did you feel like you were doing more of the investing side of things versus operations?
I'd say it sort of depended. So if I was on a live deal, and in a few situations, I was on a couple live deals. So like a portfolio company add-on and a platform. I'd say the investing side would probably at least take anywhere between 75 to 100% of my day. But absent a live deal, I'd say mostly sort of operating type of work. And then maybe 25 to 30% of the work would be kind of looking at originating deals or kind of evaluating new books that sort of hit our desk.
Got it. I wanted to ask a few last questions about your time in private equity. And first is, I know it's a simple question I've asked from earlier, but what were your hours like, kind of on a lower and mid-average and high end? And I think it's just helpful for people to know this because for all these industries, people work really hard. And I think hearing straight from like the horse's mouth of what the hours can be like would be helpful. And I will caveat for you, it's different depending on the day, depending on the project, depending on the firm. But for you, what were your hours like in private equity?
Yeah. So for me, I'd say across all three of my roles, my P hours were definitely the worst. And it was just
interesting,
minimal downtime. To your earlier point, how, about banking where you close out a deal and then you're on to the next. That was certainly the experience in P, but even worse in that there's, 3 or 4 things I'm managing at a given point in time. And so it was really tough to get a breather. And it did certainly kind of, I think, eat into my personal life as well. So I just want to be transparent about that, right? So I'd say on average, I feel like at least 70 to 80 hour weeks pretty consistently. I think on the low end, maybe 60 hours, but it was pretty rare to get that, maybe a few weeks during my 2 years. And then the high end, I remember there's a couple sort of really tough months where there's everything sort of landing it within the same window. And I feel like I inched sort of in the 100-hour week range. So didn't get a whole lot of sleep during that
intense
time.
And I think that's also something that is not as well understood at times. People think if you go to banking, to private equity, while you do, it seems, have a little bit more control. When shit hits the fan, like they're both kind of can be equally bad in terms of number of hours. And I was also, this is kind of a very different topic, but you worked in these 3 high-paced, tough kind of business industries, and they're heavily dominated by males, by white males. And I guess I'm just asking for you, like as someone who is female working in these industries that are kind of dominated by men, like did you find it ever hard to be kind of in that position, or did you ever use it as like your differentiator and like to your advantage at all? Like how can you kind of touch more upon that?
Yeah, so I'd say consulting at least in the junior levels, it's actually pretty 50-50. But certainly when you get into the client organizations, right, most of the executives you're interfacing with are male. So that's one dynamic. I think generally speaking, I didn't really over-index on that, to be honest. And I've been fortunate enough where I sort of I try to come to discussions really prepared and come across as professional and just credible. And I think with that, these older gentlemen try to really sort of reciprocate that respect, and those conversations tend to be pretty leveling. And so I personally don't think it stifled me in any way. But certainly I think as I think about, at the senior levels, right, in banking and in P, those numbers, shrink even more. And so it might be tougher in terms of like relationship building, probably harder to just go grab a drink with a prospective client if you're a female. And I think there's probably practical situations that come into play.
I didn't have obviously the same experience as you, but then I just remember when I was at JPM, all of the senior bankers were like either white males or some females, and there was like one Asian MD where I was like, oh, there are people like me that are in the senior ranks. But so anyway, I was curious about that. But as you now are, you decided to kind of leave private equity, which as I've kind of learned about from this interview, maybe for obvious reasons in terms of the hours being what they were for you. But what made you decide to leave private equity, which is a field where a lot of people even at Wharton want to go into? What made you want to leave to go to business school?
Yeah, so I think I like to caveat on the PE part. The hours are pretty rough, but the work was super interesting. Like the work I did was really fulfilling, and I became really, really close with all of my portfolio company managers and was on a texting basis with all three of my CEOs. And it just helped me level up on so many levels. So I'm certainly really grateful for the experience. I think as I started reflecting sort of, okay, where do I see my career going long term? I realized I'd been working through these high velocity roles where I didn't really have time to pause and think through that question really deeply. And I think there's certainly an element of burnout, but also I really valued having a safe space to really self reflect and discover a lot of just things that could be interesting in the walls of business school. And I'd say a few of my really close mentors in both PE and consulting who had gone through the business school route really recommended it, and so I was also kind of leaning into that as well.
What has been your favorite experience so far at school?
I'd say all the international travel. I feel like it was really tough. Outside of, I guess, visiting family in Korea, I didn't really have that much opportunity to travel internationally during between undergrad and really kind of leading up to business school. And so I really, really sort of dialed in on that aspect. I traveled, I think, like 6-7 countries within my first year.
Yeah, that's a lot. I have just a final question for you, because you have gone through so many different of these industries that honestly a lot of people really want to work in. And so this is a kind of broad catch-all question of, let's say you could go back to your 15-year-old self or 10-year-old self, whatever. If you could give your younger self advice in terms of not only career, but also personally as well, if you have anything that comes to mind, like what would you tell your former self?
Yeah, I'd say take more risk. I'm generally a pretty risk-averse person, so I think I almost like sort of naturally gravitated towards more cookie-cutter roles like banking, consulting, and PE. But I think there's certainly really good experiences I could have gotten if I did something a little more out there. For example, join a startup as employee number 10. And so I think those are the sort of opportunities I'm thinking through at this stage in my career. And so I think just being a little more adventurous about what I could be doing professionally would be one thing I might sort of try to redo.
Got it. That's interesting. I think a lot of times when a lot of the classmates that I've spoken with, it seems like everyone is kind of like on a pendulum. If they worked in something that was a little bit more risky, then they kind of want to go towards something that's a little bit more stable. If you're on the stable side, something more risky. I've certainly been on that journey myself too, where I was very stable in banking and then very, I guess, like unstable with my the companies I've started. But yeah, I wanted to, thank you so much, because I'm sure you've answered a ton of questions for people interested in banking, consulting, and private equity. So yeah, thanks so much for your time, Jen, and really appreciate you for speaking with me for this interview.
Oh, thanks, Ben.
All right, so that concludes the interview. I hope you all enjoyed. And I did also want to take a moment to kind of highlight one of the key takeaways for me throughout this conversation, which was when Jen and I were kind of talking about how she was in these 3 really kind of tough business industries. And I was asking if she ever felt like being a female was, put her at a disadvantage or anything like that. And she kind of mentioned and talked about how she always made sure that her preparedness and just her work ethic and making sure that she was always kind of on the ball never made her feel like that was ever really an issue for her at all. And this is not really more of a comment on gender, but more of just, as I was sitting there listening to her, thinking about how important that is to really make sure that regardless of what your ethnicity is or what gender you are, that you just go into your job ready to crush it every day. And that will earn the respect of your peers. And so that's, as I was listening throughout that conversation, for whatever reason, that's what really stuck with me at the end of this interview. So I hope you all enjoyed and were able to take away a lot from this conversation, because as I mentioned at the beginning, she has so many different experiences across industries a lot of people try to break into. So if you have any other questions, please let me know down in the comments below. With that said, hope to catch you all in the next episode. Thanks guys, and peace out.